Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Miller Center, or to the virtual Miller Center. As those of you here in Charlottesville know, we hope to do this in person, but thanks to our third snowstorm of the season, we're back to you as if it was the COVID pandemic all over again. It's also just over 100 days since the election in 2024 and 1 month into President Trump's second term of office. There's a lot of us to unpack and discuss on President Trump's approach to the world in his first year. But we're also here to track President Trump's national security campaign promises, looking back. And there was a long list of things that he promised to do, from ending the war in Ukraine on day one, to shifting the U.S.-China policy regarding tariffs and eliminating U.S. dependence on Chinese goods, to ending the conflict in the Middle East. Here to help us unpack all of this are a number of Miller Center faculty and fellows. For those of you who know the Miller Center, we have put together a wide and deep team of scholars and practitioners that we call the Ukraine War Room Group. As many of you know, this dedicated group has been meeting regularly since the outbreak of the war in February 2022. We tried to look at it in a global context, not just what's happening on the battlefield, but the broader strategic and diplomatic alliances, as well as the international economic dimensions, as well as it relates to other global challenges like dealing with China and now the Middle East. Because of the evolving nature of the conflict and its impact on broader geopolitics, this group has remained engaged and committed and has met regularly for now almost 3 years to continue our dialogue and analysis. Today's group includes, in alphabetical order, Dale Copeland, from the politics department, Jeff LeGros, a faculty senior fellow with us who used to be here at UVA and then went on to being provost at the University of Richmond. We're delighted to have him back now. Scott Miller, a Miller Center faculty member who also teaches at the Darden School of Business. Steve Mull, the vice provost for global affairs at UVA, who's also a practitioner senior fellow with us after years of diplomatic service, including having been ambassador to Lithuania and Poland, as well as other senior positions in government. John Owen, a professor in the politics department and a faculty senior fellow with us. Alan Stamm, former dean of the Batten School of Public Policy and Leadership, now university professor at UVA and a faculty senior fellow with us. Mara Rudman, our James Schlesinger professor, distinguished professor of international affairs, who had many years of distinguished service in the U.S. government at senior levels. And finally, Brantley Womack, now emeritus in the politics department and still with us as a faculty fellow at the Miller Center. You've already seen the lengthier bios in the pre-event slides, so I'll just briefly introduce them again as we bring them in for the conversation. As a reminder, we'll take audience questions at the end. And for those of us who have the Q&A function at the bottom of their screen, please submit your questions through that. Thanks for being here, and let's get started. Originally, President Trump said he would end the war in Ukraine on day one. Since then, Keith Kellogg, his special envoy, has said it's going to take more like 100 days. Setting aside the moving goalpost for when it would be resolved, the administration has started moving forward. A phone call between President Trump and President Putin, signals at Munich from Defense Secretary Hegseth and Vice President Vance, important meeting in Saudi Arabia, and now exchanging tweets back and forth between President Trump and President Zelensky in Ukraine. So just starting off with Alan Stamm, what does the trajectory for the peace talks look like?
Thanks, Bill, and greetings to everyone that's participating in the call. So when we think about the war in Ukraine, I think it's super important for all of us to think about what's going on from the perspective of each of the different participants. So from an American perspective, for example, where exactly this sort of the frozen border between Ukraine and Russia ends up isn't as big a deal as, for example, the expansion of NATO was 2 years ago when Finland and Sweden joined NATO. So from an American perspective, ending the war where the territorial status quo is today would not be a disaster. From the Russian perspective, the war has been horrendous outcome. Their economy is not doing great. Inflation's running 10%. But more importantly, from Russia's perspective, they claim the war began over fears of NATO expansion into Ukraine, and it precipitated an even worse outcome in the Baltic Sea. From Ukraine's perspective, obviously they're super not happy about having Russia occupying a significant chunk of Ukraine. But again, from an American perspective, it's not our greatest concern here. So if we look forward, I think the two wars we want to look back to in the 20th century to understand this would be World War I and the Korean War, where essentially we had a frozen or stalemated front line between the two protagonists for a couple of years. Now, in the World War I case, that stalemate was broken when the United States entered that war en masse in the spring of 1918. That's not going to happen today in Ukraine. The second case in the Korean War, again, for a couple of years, we had a stalemated front line between North and South Korea. And eventually the Chinese and Americans came to the realization that enough was enough. And those two great powers signed an armistice that's persisted to this day. Now, the South Korean case, the United States guaranteed that demilitarized zone by keeping some 50 to 70,000 American troops there. I think what we're going to have to see from a Ukrainian perspective is the Europeans to step up and provide the security guarantee longer term for Ukraine. But I think that the territorial disposition is going to look somewhere along the lines of where it is today, where the two front lines of the armies are.
Thank you, Alan. Really interesting and great historical perspective on that. Mara, you've served in senior levels in government before, including in the Obama administration, both at the National Security Council and in special envoy positions. You're looking at a potential peace negotiation. What should we be looking for, both in the talks themselves, but also the broader players and partners involved?
So, Bill, thanks. I want to take a step back first because you talked about the promises that President Trump made during the campaign. I think it's easy to get distracted by a lot of moving pieces and by the amount of stuff coming at us. The basic responsibility of any president of the United States is to maintain and defend the national security interests of this country. In other words, to make us more secure, not less. And yet almost every single thing I've seen this president do since the day of inauguration has made the United States less secure, not more secure. So these are not even negotiations in terms of Ukraine and Russia. They're not negotiations about peace in any sense, in any historical sense. And I appreciate Alan's historical grounding for us, but that is completely apart and different from how President Trump is going about executing his responsibilities as president of the United States. So having the United States talk to Russia and not have Ukraine there and part of those discussions, that's not a negotiation and that's not about peace. And while I may agree with Alan on what the borders ought to be, when you have one of the key players not in the room in any way, and you have the president of the United States trading insults with that key actor, the president of Ukraine, that is not a path towards any sort of sustainable solution, and it has no historical precedent.
Well, I'll say I was surprised, but also perhaps shouldn't have been surprised by the Wall Street Journal's editorial a few weeks ago criticizing President Trump. Surprised in the sense that the Wall Street Journal is part of the Fox Murdoch part of the Murdoch empire, separate from Fox, but maybe not surprised because they have been traditionally more internationalist. I want to read a quote from their op-ed about President Trump's strategy, which actually corresponds with a lot of the things that Mara said. They said, on that score, Mr. Trump is treating Mr. Putin in Russia unlike any negotiating counterpart. His usual method is to make maximalist demands and negotiate down. We'll take back the Panama Canal. But here he's making a major concession first. Most concerning is that Mr. Trump seems to be excluding Ukraine as a negotiating party, much less a partner. He announced his peace negotiation after a phone call with Mr. Putin and informed Ukraine President Zelensky after the fact. So it is quite striking to see conservative oriented editorial pages criticizing Trump. And I guess my question now, and I'll turn this to John Owen and Jeff LeGros, is what does this mean for the rest of Europe and NATO allies who don't sufficiently, President Trump has criticized them for not sufficiently investing in their own defense. And yet, since his first criticisms, nearly all of NATO's members, 23 out of 31 now, are above the required 2% on defense. So I'm curious whether Trump's negotiating style is going to continue to squeeze more out of Europe for supporting Ukraine or encourage Europe to go it alone. Why don't we start with John and then turn to Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, let me step back, take one more step back and talk about where the administration is headed. I think in terms of grand strategy, as far as we can tell, I think the general approach of the Trump administration is to join in the effort by Russia and to some extent, maybe by China, to change the way international politics works, to return it to an older way, one that's more normal in human history, but that we're not used to, certainly in the United States in the last 80 to 100 years. This is a world in which, as the ancient Greek historian Thucydides wrote, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. It's a world in which great powers deal mostly with one another and make deals over the boundaries and the fates of smaller states who then have to put up with those deals. Sometimes this means that great powers build empires. Sometimes it means they partition small states. Sometimes, by the way, it means that the great powers end up fighting one another over territory and control of smaller states. One difference between Donald Trump and, say, Prince Metternich of Austria 200 years ago is Trump is really after material resources, natural resources, economic assets, valuable real estate, not strategic locations. But it really, in a way, amounts to the same thing. And this is really a stark contrast to the world the United States has, throughout most of its history, tried to build and maintain that it's had great success with since World War II, especially since the end of the Cold War. And that's a world in which the sovereign territory of all states, small as well as large, is respected as a matter of course. And great powers still compete, but they don't compete over pieces of territory, but rather over influence and wealth. So not a perfect world, but a different world. It's been a world thick with multilateral rules and institutions, lots of economic interdependence, and a world in which America favored fellow liberal democracies. This has been the mainstream American view since the Second World War, and Americans have believed it's in America's national interest. This is not an act of altruism to create and maintain this world. But that view seems to have vacated the White House. And we can talk about whether it's possible to return to this great power dominated world in the 21st century. I don't think so, for several reasons. We can talk about whether the Trump administration will perform very well in such a great power dominated world. I don't think so. I don't think he's as good a deal maker as he thinks. But it does look like in the short run that Ukraine is out of luck. Will lose at least 20% of its territory to Russia. And then what becomes of the other 80%? It could be on its own, locked out of NATO with no U.S. protection, relying on Europe for protection, or the rump Ukraine could take what appears to be a U.S. offer of basically a partition to become economically dependent on the United States in exchange for protection. America would get access to profits from, say, natural resources such as lithium, titanium, graphite, uranium. We don't know how this is going to come up. Zelensky rejected apparently an offer from Trump to this effect, but Trump is still interested. Doubtless the Russians are talking with the Americans about this, and the Europeans are mulling all of this over as well. So we don't know how it's going to come out, but the broad outlines, as I say, point to, at least in the short term, a different world than we're used to.
Jeff, you've studied both contemporary policy making and also the historical precedents and times of militarization. Given all of that, what does this shifting world look like from your perspective?
Well, I mean, I really love John's description. Really captured me. I don't think that he's implying there's a Trump strategy to get to that world. And I think what you're seeing is a bunch of tactical decisions that don't have a clear strategy. So he's clearly calling the question on NATO. NATO, you're it, and what can you do for us? And let's hope it all works out. So the thing that does make sense, and I think does capture attention, is ending the conflict makes sense, but it doesn't make sense if it breaks the one thing that's most important to the US, which is a united West. It seems like we're in a world where we're sacrificing long-term position for quarterly profits. So yeah, the US might be able to reduce its spending on the conflict, but to this point, over 3 years, it's spent 120 billion, which amounts to about, I think, 0.06% of the annual US budget. So we're not talking big costs, and the positives of Ukrainian mineral reserves and renewed business with Russia still pale compared to what's at stake in terms of alliance solidarity and the crucial role that's going to play in the long-term competition with China, which is the real issue. Now, you might think, hey, there's a strategy here. We'll flip Russia against China. Maybe, but not really. Remember Nixon in China? China switched when they were in a war with Russia. Russia and China don't have any real conflicts at this point. And in the meantime, what you've done is you've sent into chaos the thing you absolutely need solid, which is US and advanced Western economy country solidarity. China or Russia dividing that solidarity is the biggest cause for concern over the long term. And for me, that's the thing we really need to worry about.
That's great. I want to bring in Steve Mull now. Steve, you've served, as I mentioned before, as ambassador to two countries that sit right on the borders with Russia and think about Russia all the time. And you've also served as Undersecretary of State, both of whom are now NATO allies. And you've served also as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in the first Trump administration. And you have a sense, both from that position, of how all the different pieces of the global puzzle fit together as it relates to the State Department and foreign policy, but also what it's like to work in the Trump system. So give us some insight into how both those countries are seeing it and how it kicks back out to the rest of NATO and broader U.S. strategy.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be together with so many great colleagues from the Miller Center. I think the term whiplash to describe events of the past 72 to 96 hours is too mild a term. And I think the implications of this radical shift in U.S. policy, even from the first Trump administration, is going to take several weeks and months and probably years to see the implications of it. What's particularly hard to understand about it is that after Trump won the election in November, the prospect of a return of Trump to power, in fact, set several things in motion that would have made the job of bringing about peace in Ukraine a lot easier. The Europeans clearly had begun to tire of supporting the conflict, supporting the Ukrainians, were beginning to be eager. Clearly, the Russians were getting tired of this as well. And really, within a few weeks of the election, General Kellogg was already beginning consultations with key allies to scope out what this would look like. And people were already talking about, yes, well, there'll have to be territorial compromises. There was Zelensky himself put this deal of the rare earth metals for the U.S. on the table. There was talk of security guarantees from a number of incoming members of the administration that we'd find a way to provide security guarantees, and that there would need to be some support for the reconstruction of Ukraine, saying nothing about accountability. So all of these trends were beginning to come together that would have, I think, resulted in mostly successful peace talks with everybody participating in the conflict without Ukraine accepting its partition and not recognizing Crimea, putting that aside for now. And these events of the past couple of days just ripped the scab off of so many long festering wounds. I remember from my time in Poland and Lithuania, I spent a total of 12 years in both countries where the ghost of Yalta, of the United States making deals with Stalin behind the backs and over the heads of the Eastern Europeans and the rest of the Europeans were really fresh, even though it's more than 80 years ago. People are very concerned about it. And now that we've shifted again in that direction, it's going to undermine their confidence in the United States as a security partner. Some of them will be more quiet about it than others. The Poles are having presidential elections in November, and I'm sorry, in May, and they want to be careful not to appear to reject Trump as an important security guarantor. But they are shaken to their core by these events over the past few days. It's going to be very difficult for us to win back credibility as an ally there for quite some time to come, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Steve. It's a sobering note. I want to pivot now and talk about China a little bit, and then I know a few of our fellows want to get in on that, but maybe we can tie it up after talking about China. President Trump has also made a lot of promises about China, and has started to follow through on some of them. He said he's going to impose tariffs and import restrictions, revoke China's MFN, eliminate dependence on China for essential products, and limit Chinese investment in U.S. infrastructure. On Taiwan, he said he would penalize China and even stiffer trade sanctions if they did something there. But he's also said to Taiwan that he would negotiate payment from them for U.S. defense systems. He said that he's used tariffs to move chip business and infrastructure away from Taiwan to the United States. So what's driving is there a strategy behind these promises and threats strategically and politically? I'm going to start with Brantley Womack, who taught Chinese politics here at UVA and has written about Chinese foreign policy, including with a number of states that have asymmetrical power with China. Brantley, initial thoughts?
Well, I think the key word in China policy right now, especially since the inauguration, is mixed signals. The mix is due to the tension between two administration priorities. First, to maximize the gain from America's international transactions, this transactional aspect of Trump's foreign policy and domestic policy, for that matter. And secondly, to cope with China as an antagonistic rival. As a Chinese friend of mine put it, the Trump team is divided into two groups, the America First group and the China First group. The America First group sees China as a potential card player in international transactions. The China First group sees China as the strategic enemy in the long term. The groups overlap. The tariff war, for instance, cuts both ways, so I'll leave the details of that to Scott. Is it a money raiser and a trade balancer, more like the America group thinking, or is it an attempt to cut China down as an exporter? I'll leave that to Scott again. But both groups want to pressure allies to pay their bills and pay for higher tariffs, and both see China as a threat. Thus far, I think the America group has slightly more momentum, but both groups are still there. However, the indirect effects of the policies that we've been talking about and that we'll be talking about elsewhere are very important for Asia as well as for the countries involved. Ukraine, Gaza, Europe. Imagine that you're in Taiwan watching these events in Europe and Middle East unfold. Discussions with Putin about Ukraine, but not including Ukraine. Joining in with Israeli transformation of Gaza, shutting out European allies. You put yourself in Taiwanese shoes. This fundamentally undercuts the idea of the United States as backstopping Taiwan. Does U.S. have Taiwan's back? And then you have the distant rumblings of the pressure of the Taiwanese chip manufacturers. I don't think all of this makes China more likely to invade Taiwan, but it must lower Taiwan's confidence that independence is possible. Let me stop there.
Well, thank you, Brantley. I want to talk to point to and bring Dale Copeland into this. Dale teaches international relations at University of Virginia as a Miller Center Senior Fellow and has a terrific book out on the history of the American global commerce empire, making the world safe for commerce. Dale, what are you seeing in this exchange between the U.S. and China?
Well, I agree with Brantley on many of the core issues, and I like the idea that there's a distinction between those within the, say, the Defense Department in particular, who look at China as a direct threat and want to have more presence there, not less, and the others who put America first and say, well, this is the time to maybe retrench a little bit. But just to join what Brantley said with some of the previous conversation, I think we have to distinguish between Trump's motives, the particular president, not just the administration, and the overall implications of what he has done so far. And again, it's too early to tell really whether he has a strategy or not. But I think we can say that one thing that we haven't talked about is how the international behavior affects the domestic political agenda, domestic agenda of Trump. And here's how I would frame it. A lot of what we're thinking about or what the Trump administration, I think, is doing internationally can be seen through the lens of domestic politics, which is unusual for America. Usually, politics stops at the water's edge and we have the system being more important than domestic politics. But in this case, he really has an agenda to reduce taxation, reduce the spending of the government, reduce overall costs for the America that he wants to create. And that requires, I think, for him to pull out of Ukraine, pull out, or at least reduce the level of tension with Russia and China so that there's less of a footprint overseas and it's not insecurity, or it's not making us less secure in his mind. It's just simply good geopolitics, as John said. Let's do the great power thing and reduce costs. And that will help him achieve, I think, what he wants to do at home. But the implications of this are quite startling. Yes, he can raise tariffs. That brings in money, helps him reduce income taxes. But it has a big effect on China's expectations about whether it is a favorable member of the international economy, or whether Trump indeed is indirectly or directly trying to shut him out or shut Xi Jinping and China out of the international economy. Is it a first step, in other words, to a decoupling of the two giant economies? That would be very scary for China and its economy, but it would also potentially lead in the worst extreme to a 1941 scenario where China felt it had to go on the warpath because it couldn't get the cheap raw materials or the export markets that it had before. But there's another, I think, important dimension to this in terms of implications, and that is to what extent our behavior with Ukraine has an impact on our reputation as a good ally in East Asia. I've always argued that the two are linked, that if you don't defend Ukraine when it got attacked unprovoked, then you have an implication for East Asia where China might say, well, if that's the case, and we're seeing this already, then Trump may not defend Taiwan, even if he says he will, because look what happened with Ukraine. So I think that's a major implication we have to consider, the linking of what happens with Ukraine with what happens with East Asia. Now, I don't believe that Xi Jinping really wants to go after Taiwan in the short term. There's too many risks. He could be cut off economically. But if he does perceive an opportunity, at least in the short term, whereby Trump is pulling back, asking Taiwan to pay for its own defense, and even perhaps signaling to Japan and South Korea that we're less of a strong ally with the parallel to NATO, then that might give Xi Jinping the incentive to act quickly and move quickly against Taiwan. I don't think he'll do it. I'm more positive about his prudence, but I do think that that's an implication. Oh, I think, Bill, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. Scott Miller, I want to bring you in at this point. Underlying all the conversations about China are the global commerce dimensions of it. Brantley punted a number of different balls in your direction. And I'm just curious, as Trump is starting to move these economic pieces, what you see as the impacts on the broader global trade and finance systems?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And it's wonderful to be here with the rest of my distinguished colleagues. I think there's one thing that we have to kind of take assessment of before we look at US kind of policy action towards China. And the first thing that I think is really important to note is that China has some real problems right now. Several, myself and some other Miller Center fellows were able to go to China about a month ago. And we participated in a lot of events, including a full day conference. And this is not to say, and a lot of people say, oh, China has problems, that means they're going to collapse tomorrow. No, that's certainly not the case. But the fact of the matter is that there are very real issues in China and their kind of macro economy and filtering down that they're going to have to deal with. And it didn't seem to me, being there, that they had a particularly effective plan in doing so. And so, what the United States does and what the Trump administration does will certainly matter, but I think we also have to understand that there are some very real things in China that we really have minimal control over, and that they have a big say in as well. The one thing I'll say, kind of connecting to the previous comments that were made, is that US policy action, specifically in Ukraine and regarding Russia, does have a broader kind of geo-financial implications, specifically regarding China. One thing that is relatively clear that the Chinese are doing is they are trying to find ways to hedge their exposure to American financial power in the world, right? There's been a significant run up in gold prices. For anybody who has gold in their portfolio over the last year, they'll realize that it's gone up 35, 40, 45%. And there's a real reason for that, right? That the Chinese central bank, and this is a little opaque, but most reports that I've read are pretty stable on this, is that the Chinese central bank is buying about as much gold as they can. And the reason they are doing that is so that they aren't exposed to US dollar assets that the Federal Reserve or the Trump Treasury or anybody else has. So again, this goes to the other issues that are going on in the world. But then finally, on the tariff question, what I found is very interesting is that the Trump administration, even when they proposed tariffs on China, they were significantly below what they proposed on both Mexico and Canada, right? And so I think the real question going forward is the Trump administration really going to step to the plate and put those tariffs on China? Or are they going to back down and focus on other types of geopolitical and geoeconomic implications?
That's really great. Thank you, Scott. On this broader China question, I want to ask both Jeff LeGros and Mara to comment on China, and then we'll bring others in the broader geopolitics of some moves the Trump administration made. Basically, the continental moves. Everything, the one common thread between Greenland, to some degree Canada, but also the Panama Canal, is Trump's drive for sort of territorial domain. And he's argued for that connective territorial tissue, particularly explicitly with respect to commerce with China, both navigating a thawing Arctic and also control of the Panama Canal. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about how that actually plays out. Are those concerns real? And if they are, what does it actually take to do some of these things to thwart China? Or is there something else going on here? Mara, please.
Thanks. I wasn't sure. Jeff, you want to jump in? I think those are all great questions, Bill. I actually come back to the frame that John laid out earlier because, and some of the other comments that have been made. I don't think this is strategic, and I don't think we should give it that. I think what I would give this president, and it shouldn't be construed as a compliment, but is that he has very sharp instincts and his behavior is instinctual and tactical. And so I would put all of his actions in that. I think that that is some of the reason for the chaos that we're seeing, because I don't think that I think he may have a destination he wants to get to. I don't think he thinks through the steps that are going to be necessary to get there. And so, with respect to China, yes, it is accurate that China is an ever looming competitor for the United States. It's the reason the last two national security strategies and national defense strategies have talked about China as the pacing competitor for the United States. But it also goes to the strategies that presidents before Trump have had, which is that the United States needs to be most effective at investing in itself and its own abilities, protecting its supply chains. But that requires working with friends and allies. So this is where he has a series of tactics they don't add up. If you talk about wanting to move semiconductors and more chip manufacturing to the United States, which President Biden wanted to do as well and did some of, you actually need the critical mineral inputs for those chips. China controls 90%, 95%, depending on which minerals there are. And forcing Ukraine to give us half of what they have or all of what they have isn't the answer. Greenland has tremendous mineral resources, as does Canada. So some of what Trump wants is to get to that stuff, but his way of doing it is not going to get us there. And in fact, it's going to further impede our ability to build the kinds of networks we need to build around the world to be able to compete effectively with China. The one last thing I would say is we should not lose sight of, I disagree with Dale on that they're separate domestic and international, because national economic security are both incredibly intertwined for the United States and almost every country in the world at this point. And the things we need to do with our supply chains, no better example of it. By the way, we also need minerals for most of our weapon systems, critical minerals as well. And so that is in contradiction with Elon Musk. It may seem like ancient history now, basically blew up the continuing resolution back in the fall that was going to fund the government. He had a bunch of different reasons. What he didn't say out loud was that within that continuing resolution was a provision that would have penalized his quite significant Tesla investments in China. That provision was dropped in the version that ultimately went through Congress. So Elon Musk has himself a number of competing interests here. And I don't know who Trump is listening to at any given moment, but I have no confidence that there's any strategic vision that's going to make the United States more secure in terms of the challenges we face with China.
Jeff, you've again looked at broad geopolitics, particularly around military strategy.
Lost you there, Bill. I think Bill's frozen, so I'm just going to dive in here and try to reconcile the tension in the administration. And I think it's what we're seeing with kind of Greenland, Panama, and China behind it is this effort to reconcile what Brantley referred to, which are two camps within the administration itself, the America First camp and the China First camp. And it's clear where Trump's heart is, which is the America First camp. I mean, if you look, for example, at Secretary Rubio's Department of State's website, priorities for foreign policy, it's immigration and borders, basically culture wars stuff, and doing away with climate policies that weaken America. China is nowhere on there as a priority. Trump's inauguration speech, China is not mentioned, even though there's no question it's the central strategic concern facing the United States. But America First isn't necessarily China. So, you invoke China around the Panama Canal, you invoke it around Greenland, which are, as people have referred to, are just kind of his instinct for real estate and resources. They're not the big moves that are going to decide the competition with China. So he's kind of invoking a modern day Monroe Treaty to kind of square the circle. The problem now isn't European involvement in the Americas, it's China's. And as Mara pointed out, there are, in fact, some real challenges there that we need to be aware of. I do think that over time, you're going to see more and more attention to China. You've got Rubio, you've got Waltz, they're big China hawks. And I just think the real world challenges from China are going to pressure the administration in that direction.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks for jumping in as I froze here. I guess it's not just snowing out, but we're back to COVID with Zoom freezes. Let me take this conversation to the Middle East. Mara, you spent time as a senior Middle East negotiator back in the Obama administration. President Trump said that he was going to solve the Middle East thing, and it got, at some level, we got to a truce. His campaign promise happened before he actually took office. So, so there is some movement there, and including a question already from the audience. Despite Trump's approach, since his election win, there's now a potential settlement in the Israeli-Hamas conflict and seemingly real negotiations underway in the Ukraine war. Are these not positive outcomes? You know, are we seeing progress, as painful as it is to watch, in the Middle East? Or did the Trump switchback in saying that he was going to take over Gaza undo that progress?
We are seeing a tenuously held ceasefire agreement, and discussions related to it continue to move forward. At this point, that is despite and not because of the statements of the President of the United States. So the ceasefire agreement that was put together, that was based on what President Biden had laid out in May of last year and came together in the last few weeks of his administration, undoubtedly had strong behind-the-scenes help from Steve Witkoff, who does appear to be, and from reports of those who had worked with him on those negotiations, a very able negotiator, a quick study, a good read of people, beyond the fact that he has real estate business experience. And so he was very helpful in that time. I have noted the public statements he has made that are much more constructive than the statements that President Trump has made, but they are rare. So I believe that Steve Witkoff, as an envoy there, is helping to keep the hostage negotiations going, the hostages continuing to come out, which is the phase one of the ceasefire, and Israel has some major decisions to make on proceeding with phase two, which is necessary to get the rest of the hostages out, but requires an agreement to a permanent ceasefire. And it is not clear that they are there. Prime Minister Netanyahu is involved in a lot of his own domestic politics over it, and in trying to figure out how much he's going to take on or not his extreme right. President Trump gave that extreme right a huge gift in the statement about, and Bill, to be clear, it wasn't just about the United States taking over Gaza. It was removing the entire Palestinian population of Gaza, 2 million people, involuntarily. There's a word for that. There are words for that. They're very troubling words, and that is ethnic cleansing. And those are words that many Israelis and Jewish people all over the world are quite familiar with because of what was done in World War II. And so that was not any kind of solution. That is not progress toward an end. That's also destabilizing the region. The very countries, Egypt and Jordan, who have been trying hard to get the ceasefire in place, would be destabilized tremendously if President Trump's statement went forward. My only hope at this point, in terms of talking some sense into getting to an actual agreement that would be sustainable and work between Israelis and Palestinians, frankly, rests now with the Saudis. And I sure hope that the Saudis had a high price for holding being the host for the session between Russia and the United States last week. The Saudis understand that Israel and Hamas both need to get on board on this phase 2 of the ceasefire. They understand there needs to be a pathway to a Palestinian state. They understand the ramifications if that does not happen. And they understand that people want them to have an agreement with Israel, like the Abraham Accords. So they hold a lot of the keys right now. And they're also clearly have a very strong relationship with President Trump. And I hope that there were some of those conversations about what was going to happen next that happened at the margins of these meetings in the last few days that were taking place in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Maura. So I want to turn to Steve. Steve, for a number of different reasons, you've focused on the region. Part of your work at the State Department at the end of the Obama administration focused on Iran and the implementation of the nuclear agreement. And then after a short time away, you came back in and served as Undersecretary of State during the Trump administration under Secretary Pompeo. And for those people out there who don't know what that job is, basically that's looking at the entire chessboard of U.S. national security policy and advising the Secretary and Deputy Secretary and coordinating all of the regional assistant secretaries, which are the really important workhorses of the State Department. So as you look at the global I don't know if it's a jigsaw puzzle or chessboard, Steve, and you see these negotiations going on, including the super complicated one in the Middle East. Put yourself in the position, whoever's serving in that role under Secretary Rubio. What do you think that person might be saying to Secretary Rubio? How is Rubio trying to manage all of this?
Thanks. Well, I think it's important to say I can't think of the last time an incoming presidential administration in the United States inherited such a favorable strategic posture in the Middle East. We have the ceasefire that began with Hamas at the very beginning of the administration. We have, for the first time in many years, a decent chance for Lebanon to finally take control of its sovereignty, taking advantage of the substantially weakened Hezbollah as a result of the Israeli attacks. We have Assad gone after a 14-year brutal civil war that has completely rejiggered the position of Iran in the Middle East. Iran no longer has the land bridge into towards the Mediterranean to supply Hezbollah. They're really on their back foot in their withdrawal from Syria after Assad's departure. Iran is very much on its back foot, and there have been indications over the past several months that Iran's ready under President Pezeshkian to take another try at engaging with the West. And given the correlation of events in the region and their relative weakness compared to what they've been like for the past 8 to 10 years, I think this is a really important opportunity to start exploring that. Now, the incoming Trump administration seems to have been somewhat sending mixed messages on this, which actually could be helpful in bringing about a new kind of engagement with Iran, trying to advance our interests. Trump has said a couple of times he doesn't want Israel to go to war there. He doesn't want a war against Iran. He doesn't want military action against the growing Iranian nuclear program. And Witkoff has said a couple of times that he's eager to play a role, that Iran's going to be part of his broader portfolio in the Middle East. Trump has sidelined and attacked the biggest architects of the maximum pressure campaign on Iran from his first administration, Pompeo, Brian Hook, General Milley. So who knows? There could be an opportunity there. I hope there's back channel diplomacy going on to explore how a dialogue might start to look at how we can get the Iranian nuclear program back in the box and get some commitments from Iran on its missile program and its really destabilizing support for proxies throughout the region. The risk is, as other colleagues have mentioned, by acting on instincts to fly off the handle with ill-considered remarks, the effort to colonize Gaza. All of these things, as Mara mentioned, can be really destabilizing and spoil the huge strategic opportunity I think we have in the region right now.
That's great, Steve. I really appreciate the broader strategic perspective, including the favorable position we're in the region and some of the early signals. I want to turn now to the whole group, and we've got about 10 minutes before we go fully to audience Q&As and talk a little bit about the traditional tools of U.S. foreign policy and what we're seeing in the early days of the administration of how they use them. That is, the president has a national security establishment. It's the biggest part, the greatest number of employees in the U.S. federal government. It has things like foreign assistance as a tool. It also has intelligence as a tool. And so I'm curious, while President Trump is unleashing a reform government approach led by Elon Musk in a number of different regards, whether those tools will be used in non-traditional ways or new ways. I'm going to start with Alan Stam, who not only studies leadership and studies national security, but served in the U.S. military early in his career. Alan, give us a quick take on how President Trump sees the tools of national security.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. So I think one of the big shifts, so over the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen an enormous increase in the use of economic sanctions as both a coercive tool and the threat of sanctions as a deterrent tool. From President Trump's perspective, I think that economic sanctions aren't as useful as he would like because they do require the cooperation of other actors, particularly other states, which most of the policies that we've seen emerge in the last few weeks seem to be trending away from cooperative solutions and more towards unilateral ones. What we're seeing instead of sanctions is the threat and the use of tariffs to an almost unprecedented level. Now, I think that there's two sets of tariffs that what we're seeing. One is an increase in the base level of tariffs, some of whom will be aimed at our allies. And these are essentially, I think, an attempt to bring manufacturing base back to the United States. The second use of the tariffs are threatened uses, sort of as we saw with Mexico and Canada. Right now, there's a proposal to begin negotiations with China, and so it's difficult to say whether the tariffs that he's threatened to impose on China are part of a base tariff tax or more of a coercive tool. Both, if we look back at his first administration, President Trump, compared to his predecessor and successor, seemed to be loath to engage in foreign wars, although we can point to numerous examples of the use of force. I mean, American presidents of both parties over the past 100 years have used force at rates greater than most any other state in the international system. From a leadership perspective, as others have mentioned, President Trump looks at things quite tactically and very transactionally. The other big difference, I think, is that he's deeply skeptical of the general theory of the last 20 or post-Cold War years of engagement as a pathway to success. He's looking at a much more traditional, as John Owen mentioned, a sort of mercantilist view. He's not looking so much for win-win solutions, but rather unilateral outcomes that will benefit the United States. And when he believes, or his advisors believe, that coercion can produce that, I think we'll see it. I think we'll see far less military threats, military coercion than we did in the previous administration. But again, he wants to have some big wins, and Mara and others are skeptical. I think there are others that are a little bit more optimistic that we're definitely seeing different approaches, new approaches, whether one concludes those are just tragically irresponsible choices or, in fact, innovative new solutions. Time's going to tell.
That's really great. Thank you, Alan. I'm curious for others to jump in on this. Jeff, you've studied militaries in the past, and militarization in the context of great power rivalry. Are we seeing a demilitarization potentially, or what are the strategic implications, perhaps, of a more isolationist America First approach?
Yeah, I think probably isolationism is the wrong word to use for Trump. I think unilateralism for sure, and the transactional word that's come up repeatedly. You know, for me, my thoughts about it are a little bit similar to Alan in the sense that yes, he's relied on economics. I'm not so confident he isn't going to turn to military means in the second term. I think we might be surprised. Um, I think where he was very hesitant in the first term, the types of threats that he's allowed to be out there right now, that is not ruling out force vis-a-vis Greenland and Panama. You know, it could be bluffing, just putting down a marker, but I think that is the kind of force he would be more comfortable using. It's hard to imagine, given the rather hesitant profile of the first administration. But I think that is a real unknown this time. And we have to keep in mind he's got people in charge of the Pentagon and national intelligence who are unknowns, Hegseth and Gabbard. And they're making moves there that are shaking things up. That's causing a lot of uncertainty about what might happen in the future. Um, you know, certainly in terms of traditional tools and what he might do with them, you know, and particularly on the domestic front, it would be wonderful if they actually made progress on reforming defense acquisition and contracting and the attention needed in the industrial base. I would hope people would tell him, you could be a great statesperson and you could be a great American by improving America's readiness for a real conflict. I'm not sure that's where he's going to go.
I'm curious to get thoughts from the entire group about the Trump National Security Team. Mara, you've served at senior levels, including watching a new team come together. Steve Mull, you've served, but others study leadership and the role of decision making and bureaucratic processes. So maybe Steve and Mara, why don't you each give us a minute, and then others in the group please join in, including Brantley and Scott on the economic side, what you see coming together both on economics and China policy. Steve, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, you know, before I joined UVA back in 2018, I spent 36 years as a foreign service officer in different places around the world, and I've never seen the kind of highly personalized, really prizing personal loyalty in a public approach to diplomacy in my entire time of working in the State Department. If you look at State Department press releases, in the past, they almost never mentioned who the president was. If the secretary was speaking, obviously it would quote the secretary, but typically they focused on events and how those events advanced American interests. That's changed completely. Now, press releases from the State Department very much mirror the president's own pronouncements on social media with uses of hyperbole and all capital exclamations, and always pointing out that every single thing that is happening in U.S. foreign policy is to advance what President Trump wants. And so it's a message that's really been sent throughout the State Department and broader bureaucracy that if they want to stay employed, they need to think of themselves as a personal instrument of the president. So in terms of discipline, the State Department's not always been the most disciplined practitioner of our nation's foreign policy. So that could be good, but I think there's also a danger in overly personalizing, and I think that, in fact, hurts our long-term effectiveness in pursuing our permanent interests.
Yeah, Mara, you'd mentioned a few players on the team before. I'm in particular interested to hear your thoughts about how now Secretary Rubio, will play in this context. You probably had interactions with him in the past.
Yeah.
He was seen as a more moderate member of the team. He's now literally got the weight of the world on his shoulders. How do you imagine him playing in the context of this team coming in?
Yeah, I wouldn't have described him as moderate. I described him as a more traditional conservative, and he's surrounded by a lot of radicals. And he also happens to be someone who actually had experience as a senator and knew about the rest of the world and had traveled there and had negotiated with people, had listened to and had discussions with people with whom he disagreed to try to get to compromises. It may seem hard to remember, but Marco Rubio was initially one of the leaders of a deal on immigration uh, uh, until he backed out of it, I think, during the first President Trump term. So Secretary Rubio is one of the few, and I think he's in a lot of very uncomfortable positions now, but who I had some degree of confidence in. I'm far more concerned about the Secretary of Defense, who seems to be overly absorbed with, and had telegraphed it very clearly, he's all about culture wars inside the United States, and apparently also in pushing for far-right extremists in other countries, and not focused on the types of very good issues that Jeff talked about that I studied heavily as part of the National Defense Strategy Commission, on improving defense acquisition, on improving innovation, uh, on increasing recruiting to our armed forces, because we don't have the resources and the people to mount credible threats, never mind to Greenland and the Panama Canal, but to actually real adversaries, real competitors. So I'm concerned about that. And Tulsi Gabbard, I think the one thing that will happen with intelligence is other countries were giving them plenty of reasons to continue ignoring us. And we haven't even talked about the complete dismantling of the Agency for International Development. So what this president and this team are doing on national security, it is unilateral, for sure. It's unilateral disarmament of the United States and our ability to function effectively around the world. And again, being able to defend and protect the security and safety of Americans. And as you can tell, I'm deeply concerned about it.
Brantley and Scott, what are you seeing both with respect to China and with respect to economic policy? The players on the team.
Well, first, let me return to a point that Mara started with, which was national security is to lower the risks facing the United States and raise capabilities in countering those risks. And I think that the not Fortress America isolationism, but McKinley era nationalistic individualism of the Trump administration is something that isolates us from countries that are maybe formally our allies or not even formally our allies, but think with us. And now they think again because they see the United States now as a very different place, and a place that looks only after its own interests and not on common interests. I think that's a fundamentally serious problem. And I think Rubio has well expressed this retreat from America as middle of a global system to America as the card holder, card player, not dealer, but card player in an international game.
Mm-hmm. Scott, what are you seeing?
Yeah, very briefly, I would say two things. One is, while I am relatively critical of a lot of things that the administration is doing, I think one of the things that has a lot of potential is its movement towards new defense contractors, specifically firms like Anduril and Palantir and those kinds of things. We certainly need the defense primes, and I'm not in any way saying that we should move away from those. But the idea that, if anything, the war in Ukraine has shown us is that technological and small scale, cheap assets has been able to really hold sway on a battlefield in new ways. And so reorienting the American defense base, not just building out what we had during the Cold War, but looking for new alternatives, I think is quite interesting and I think quite promising. The other thing I would say is, if they are indeed, and I think that if is a very, very, very big thing here, at least some attention to the national debt could be very, very good. I have my skepticism about this, but the one thing I can say for a fact is there is a massive separation between Washington and Wall Street in terms of how they perceive the viability of the American debt long term. People in Washington tend to think it's relatively manageable. people on Wall Street are very, very, very nervous that the bond vigilantes are going to come calling much sooner than we think. We obviously don't have a crystal ball on that front, but I think if the Trump team can do something on that issue, it will be very good in the long run.
That's really great. We have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to save the last 5 minutes for a speed round with the group. But I do want to throw a couple questions out there for the group from the audience. So there are two that I think are somewhat related to one another. One is there anything the U.S. can do to prevent further alignment between Russia and China? And the second is, can the panel comment on the future of Russia's economy and the toll on the war? And the two, I think, are not unrelated. The more the war takes a toll on Russia, the more, had we been isolating Russia, which we have been for 3 years, the more Russia has to turn to China, and perhaps vice versa. So potentially with this thawing, I'm curious whether people see potential changes in the relationship between Russia and China, and also how Russia might respond given the state of its economy.
I mean, I think that this is so I agree with my colleagues, Jeff, Mara, others who say that Trump is not acting strategically or thinking. He's a tactician and he has impulses and instincts that sometimes serve him well, at least in the short term. I think lead to long-term big problems, bankruptcy in the private sector, or worse things as a president. But I do think one instinct is I can peel Russia away from China. This has been called for by a number of academic realists. And I'm skeptical it can succeed in the medium to long term, but I do think that's part of what's going on here. Notice that the Trump presidency is also saying nice things, which really matters, nice things about Xi Jinping. And so there's maybe an effort to triangulate, and this fits in maybe with what I said earlier about the idea that great powers deal with each other, like mafia bosses, and the smaller countries don't matter as much. They have to put up with what happens. And the risk here is that great powers also do fight wars against each other as they compete in a much less rule-bound international system. So that's where I would take this. Yeah.
Dale Copeland.
Yeah, just to build briefly on John's thoughts and come back to the question of Russia, China, and what we could do to reduce their tendency to align with one another. They are natural enemies. Let's not forget. They almost went to war in 1969, and they share a very long border that China has always been worried about. But the main point, I think, is that China itself is torn. On the one hand, it doesn't mind having the West kind of diverted by the Ukraine war, and that allows, China to be less of the bad guy, less of the center point. But on the other hand, China has very strong economic interests with the EU. It's its largest trading partner. And it was building these high-speed railways through Central Asia, through Ukraine and Russia, to get goods to the EU, which became about 5% of its total trade with the EU by about 2021. And now it's almost zero. So it would love to get that back. It would love to see the war over so it could get back to building those high-speed railways, Belt and Road Initiative, and so forth. Now, what does that mean? I think it means that China, if there's any strategy to Trump, and I don't think there is because I think it's about domestic politics, but if there is a larger strategy, it's not to decouple with China, not to alienate China, but to convince China that it is a common great power in this larger great power system that has Russia as a smaller member of that group. And that means that they can get back to focusing on domestic issues. China wants to develop. It's, as Scott said, it's got a bad economy right now. It wants to get the trade going with Europe so that it can rejuvenate its own economy. And if Trump can play that card, that could help China say, you know what, we're more interested in working with the West, specifically the US, than with Russia.
I'm curious to get people's reaction to what Dale said, which is really quite interesting. But for Taiwan, it really opens the question: does this new approach to China make China more likely or less likely to do something precipitous in Taiwan? Are they reading a signal that the Trump administration would be fine to let it happen, or that actually there's no need to do it because they have no fear of Trump trying to cordon off and peel Taiwan away from it?
Well, I can jump back in very briefly to
Please.
say that there are three elements of our deterrence strategy. One is the great costs and risks to China of just crossing 100 miles of open sea to land troops. That's very costly, a very big D-Day. The second is the risk of a direct war with the US, which I think has been lowered, and that reduces our deterrent. But the third deterrent we've kind of missed out on, which is the threat of economic sanctions like we did against Russia, and whether China fears that part of our deterrent pillar of strength. And I actually think that that one is the most up in the air because Trump may not want to do big economic sanctions. It's already reduced his tariff threats. So I'm not sure that we have a good deterrent. The good news is that it's very hard for China to take Taiwan in a direct way, even without U.S. Intervention.
That's really great, Dale.
And
One last open invitation to our Zoom to comment on any of this before we turn to our lightning round. Anybody else have one that they want to get in?
if I could say something about the Taiwan question, I don't think that the absence of American support for Taiwan would be a particular incentive for an invasion for reasons that Dale gave. I mean, the ultimate in Chinese military strategy is to win without a war. And if the incentive in Taiwan no longer includes a viable independence option, then that is success, not success of D-Day across the straits.
Got it. A really, really helpful framing to take us into speed round, lightning round here. The way this is going to work is I'm going to ask a common question to everybody in our group, and I'm going to go one by one through them and get a 30-second response. And for those of you here in Charlottesville that go to UVA basketball, you'll know that we're all fans of the shot clock. We take it right down to 30 seconds, both on offense and on defense, we hope. And so I'm encouraging all of our panelists to do that, so much so that we actually have a shot clock for this go around. So starting with Dale Copeland and then going in alphabetical order, the simple question to all of our panelists is, what is the single most important thing you're going to be watching in the next 2 months? The first month of the Trump administration is already, because of the whirlwind of activity, is already dog years, feels like a year. We've got 2 months to go till the 100-day mark. And I'm curious for everybody to talk about the one thing they'll be watching at the top of their list. So Dale, starting with you, you've got 30 seconds.
Okay. I feel like I'm on a game show. The basic thing that I would look for is what is our economic strategy towards China? Are we going to keep tariffs relatively low, not more of a bargaining thing, or are we going to go after a big grand strategy of decoupling? I think we're going to do the former, and we're going to keep tariffs at 10%. And that will help China think, okay, we're not going to be punished too much, and we can work with the system. But if we go towards decoupling, all bets are off, and the whole thing in Asia could really blow up in our face.
Thank you. Terrific. Jeff LeGros. Oh, you're on mute, Jeff.
Sorry. I'm going to be watching what is central to the long-term future of the United States, and that's its relative economic productivity and standing. And so that means two things are key to that. The first is the treatment of allies. If we're going to thrive, we have to continue economic and technological cooperation, trade, and interdependence with them. It's key to our future growth, and solidarity is key leverage on China. The second thing is respect for the rule of law, probably the single most important asset for the working of our economy, its attractiveness. Of course, it's key to the strength of the dollar and the desirability of our bonds. Those are the two things I'll be watching.
That's great. You added a thing and you went over the shot clock. Scott Miller, 30 seconds. What are you watching?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I'm going to be looking at, a little bit of an curveball here, is looking at the performance of the Trump and Melania meme coins. Quite frankly, they've opened up a huge avenue for foreign sources to essentially influence the Trump family. And so seeing how that actually works, I think could be quite interesting, especially as different elements do come up over the next few months. So I'm going to be seeing how movements in that correlates with different interests that emerge on the world stage.
Thanks. Steve Mall.
I'm going to be most interested in the fate of this proposed summit between Putin and Trump, which yesterday Trump said could conceivably happen before the end of this month, in the next week, which seems impossible and just such a terrible error to go rushing into a summit. So if cooler heads prevail and it's delayed, that I think will be an important signal. If it happens, let's see what comes out of it. That could be a really important inflection point in American history.
Thank you, Steve. John Owen.
Yeah, I actually think what we normally consider a domestic question is most important for foreign policy, and that is whether, when the inevitable Supreme Court decision comes down against the Trump administration, the president will abide by that decision or defy it. Because that moment will determine whether America continues to be a constitutional state, a law-governed state. It will be of enormous importance to our democratic allies, to people seeking democracy around the world, to authoritarians everywhere, and to the future of international order.
Thank you, John. And landed it before the clock. Alan Stam.
I think Mara's supposed to be before me, but I'll take this off. So
yes, I'm sorry. I got the order wrong. Mara and then Alan.
So, okay, I'll jump in
Mara,
then.
please. Yeah, I
Thanks.
screwed that up.
Thanks. No. Well, I would double down on the point that Jeff and John made on respect for the rule of law. I think the next 100 days will have key determinants on whether we continue as a constitutional democracy. I think that is both what our courts do, Article 1 of the Constitution, and it is our courts Article 3, and what our legislative body does as Article 1, if they start remembering that there is supposed to be checks and balances. And I think some of that will come from the political effect people feel domestically in their states, and they start worrying about being reelected based on the cost to people of these actions.
That's great. Alan, over to you. Sorry about that.
Sure, thanks. So I'm much more sanguine about some of these bold moves and aggressive economic stature of the Trump administration than my colleagues here are. The concern I have, however, is the possibility of nuclear proliferation, particularly in the security front. That if we push our allies and friends too hard, many of them will say, hey, we're going to throw in the towel and go our own way. And it will only take one state to make that decision to lead to a cascade of disastrous consequences. So the Trump administration is going high risk, high reward here.
Thank you. And finally, Brantley Womack.
Well, I think clearly President Trump likes to meet people. And as Steve points out, the possibility of a Putin-Trump summit, I think that one possibility to watch out for is arrangements for a Xi Jinping-Trump meeting. And if that isn't in the schedule in the next 2 months and a comprehensive tariff increase on China is adopted, then I think that would show the relative strength of those two camps, of the America first or the China first groups in the administration.
That's really great. So I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask our tech team to run the clock on me, and I'll give you my own 30 seconds, and then I'll bring us to a close. There we go. So what I'm watching for, presidential first years almost always have a national security disaster. And the important thing, we can go back to the Bay of Pigs in the 1960s. We can go to Afghanistan in 2021 and President Biden, Black Hawk Down and others. So I'm watching to see how the team comes together. Will he confirm his deputies by the 100th day? That's a good benchmark. And when a crisis, a true crisis hits between now and then, how do they react? So with that, I am really thrilled to have this great team at the Miller Center, not just this collection of scholars, but the tech team, our support team that pivoted after a snowstorm, our own version of a natural disaster in Charlottesville, 2 inches of snow can be just insane for all of us here. We pivoted brilliantly, and I'm really appreciative of them and appreciative of you, the audience, for jumping with us to Zoom and for all your many questions and your support over this year. And we'll see you soon at the next Miller Center event. Take care.